So, hi, everybody. Welcome to a special episode of Security Dilemma Podcast. Today, we're actually doing a webinar. And you might ask why, because we don't typically do webinars here at JQA. But the reason that we wanted to focus specifically on the private sector and risk consultancy is, of course, just that foreign policy degrees and career paths are generally really focused on federal jobs, and particularly on the GS scale. Since it seems likely that there are going to be fewer of those jobs available in the next couple of years, we wanted to make sure that we offered some insight into what other types of foreign policy careers are available to folks who maybe are graduating into this new and unusual job market, or for folks who have been laid off and who are looking for other roles that will make sure that they keep their foreign policy expertise for the time being. So in order to do that, we have three panelists with us today. I'm going to ask y'all to go around and just say a little bit about, who you are, where you work, what you do. And I guess we'll go ahead and start with Natalie.
Okay. Hi, I am Natalie Armbruster. I am a senior Middle East intelligence researcher at Seerist. So what do? I look at the Middle East every single day, and I let clients know what's going on, what will be going on, and how that would affect them. Obviously, my job has been very boring the past year, so I have nothing to talk about. But yeah, that in a nutshell.
Okay, great. Let's go to John. John Goodnight.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. John Goodnight here. I'm the Chief of Staff for John Hulsman Enterprises. I guess a unique perspective that I'll probably be able to offer throughout this webinar is I don't do so much of the ins and outs of the day-to-day research or the content building as much as I manage our client relationships, our schedule, contracts, expanding clients, and all of those good things. So that's the perspective I'll try to provide throughout the webinar.
Awesome. And last but not least, Scarlett.
Hey, yeah, I am an analyst at a company called Valens Global. I graduated about 2 years ago, and I started working right out of college. As I speak here, I would just like to say my perspective is very much from someone who works at a smaller company and will differ from someone who works at, say, a Booz Allen. I've only ever worked at Valens Global since I started there out of college, so that is the only experience I'm familiar with. So with everything I say, I guess just know that's the perspective of someone working at a smaller private sector firm. We do a lot of niche projects. So specifically, I do most of my work on expert witness testimony. So our clients are mostly law firms, and I'll look at details on different attacks that occurred in the Middle East and attribute them to specific terrorist groups. This past year, I've done a lot of project management, so I've done some of that as well. And that's pretty much what I do.
Awesome. Well, it's great to have all three of you on here. And just to zoom out, what is political risk and how do political risk firms navigate it?
I think when we think about political risk with Dr. Hulsman, we think about what are the hot spots in the world around us? Where can things go wrong? And if those things go wrong, what are the things that led to that? We use a very history-oriented lens at our firm. I know a lot of other firms will use a lot more data. We don't so much do that. We're very history-driven. So we say, we'll look at a certain region in the world and say, what does history tell us about that region? And how can that history help us tell the future of what could happen there? And if these things do happen, what are going to be the consequences, and how can we potentially avoid those consequences? If we can't avoid the consequences, then how can we properly navigate them?
Yeah, I do political and security risk consulting, so I think I do a lot more maybe hard security, very specific intel versus something as broad as, country analysis. Mm-hmm. But political risk is anything from an election to, I just recently did a report on the Greenland elections, which no one would have cared about if Donald Trump hadn't said that he wants to buy it. So it can be even just an interview that opens up a whole can of worms. Obviously, I focused on the Middle East. So what did I do this past year? It was a lot of what are the parts that are as you say, like hotspots. Looking at Lebanon specific, we had a ton of clients in Lebanon. And so for maybe 9 months, we had 10 to 25 kilometers. That was at risk. That's the only part that we were focusing on. And then all of a sudden, it absolutely blew up. And all of our clients in Beirut are looking to us for where are we targeting, things like that. And so it can get very, very, very specific, street and asset level specific. But it can be anything that would affect a client. It could be what are threats being made against our CEO. It could be what elections are influencing what countries you want to do business with. It could be a deterioration of a security environment. Look at Syria, for example. And so we do retroactive and predictive analysis. So we're saying what has happened, what are you looking for in like a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly. And because we do security risk and political risk, we have an entire platform that clients can buy into and put in their information and say, okay, this was 5 miles away from our office, and this is why this affects me personally. And so we do a lot of empowering, maybe there is a 2-person team at a company that has to do all of the intelligence for that entire firm. So we're empowering Intel analysts as well as doing our own intelligence.
Excellent. And what is a day in the life of a political risk or a expert consultant look like? Maybe we'll start with Scarlett this time.
Yeah, so for me, like I said, I do a lot of project management on top of the normal research and analysis. I usually start my morning by seeing where the project lies at the time. We get a lot of quick turn work. So we've had clients even email and need a new deliverable within the next couple hours before. And you have to get the whole team suddenly going full steam ahead to get that done. So mostly seeing where things stand. Sometimes some bigger projects, you have to spend a lot of time looking at where everything is if it's been going on for a while to make sure nothing slips through the cracks. Also, I think being at a smaller company, they put a lot of their analysts across different projects. So while I am primarily working on expert witness testimony, I've also done a lot of other different types of work. We've done some reputational risk assessments, so I've pitched in on those, just doing open source research on different people that maybe a client wants to associate with, and they want to see if they've said anything controversial, that they maybe it would risk their reputation if they did associate with that person. And then in addition to the traditional expert witness testimony work, we've done what's called exploratory research, which is more generalized research into things like, did this company potentially fund ISIS illegally, to sort of help support other types of cases. Usually the end goal is to ultimately sue a country such as Syria or Iran. Typically Iran, occasionally Syria. Recently I've done some work on seeing if Syria could maybe be linked to supporting former regime elements, which that would be a big deal because it's already been established that Iran supported groups like Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Former regime elements have so far not been traced back to any specific state sponsor. So if we were able to establish that, that would mean that a lot of victims who previously weren't eligible to have their day in court would then be eligible to have that, or their families if the victim themselves are dead. I think that's a pretty good summary of the types of work I do. I would say it's definitely widely varied and very touch and go. So one day might be very slow and the next might be extremely hectic, and really just pulling together resources to get it done. And yeah, each day is completely different. I will say that.
I was going to say a lot of this will sound very familiar to listeners of ours who have worked in places like the government's own intelligence world. I mean, this sounds very familiar to my ears from friends in that space. Natalie, how about you? Day in the life.
Wake up in a cold sweat, thinking, what has just happened while I was asleep? Just like Scarlett said, I think covering the Middle East and being on the Eastern time zone, every day I wake up and go, what's happened? I once got a really terrible email at 9:30 asking about riots in Mauritania of all places, that had gone on while I was asleep. And truly, I apologize for being asleep while that happened. But I'll zoom out and say a weekly basis because I think my days are extremely structured. I have a list of countries, and obviously I have a region that I focus on. So every day I'm looking at the same countries, the same region, saying, what's happened? What am I looking for? At this point, it's been a year and a half. I know what I'm looking for. I know what happens on the ground. But we have, like, part of what political risk consulting is also responding to things, but saying these are things that we would respond to. So we have lists for every single country, every single scenario, saying this is what we think will happen. This is our outlier scenario. This would absolutely blow my mind, but maybe it could happen. And we have lists of things under all of those scenarios that say, well, if X, Y, and Z happens, this is what we would advise. If X, Y, and Z happens, this is what we would advise. And so a lot of my days, thankfully, nothing like that happens. And we get to just say business as usual. But certainly you wake up and something has absolutely gone awry, and that's a completely different day. That's writing tons of analysis, tons of reactionary things saying, okay, well, this is what this means. This is what this changes. Or maybe it changes nothing. A lot of the time, the news really blows something up. And in reality, nothing's changed for you on the ground. And so that's equally important analysis to put out there. And then we do a lot of just weekly. This is what's going to happen next week. This is what happened this week. These are things to look out for. These are places that have higher risk or lower risk based on what's happened this week. Quarterly, this is what's happened this quarter. Look at very beautiful maps and graphs and blah, blah, blah. And this is what we expect next quarter. It's a lot of forecasting. It's a lot of general analysis. I'm very lucky. That's what I wanted to do. We have people at our firm who do client specific, country specific, and their days are completely different. But very unlike Scarlett, I have so much structure. I know every day exactly what I'm doing, as long as things go well and nothing crazy happens.
How about you, John?
Yeah, I think for me, it's really so client need focused. Natalie kind of brought this up a little bit ago of the work really does change depending on the client, what the client wants. Some clients will really surprise you. I'll keep it pretty broad, but about a year and a half ago, we had a toothpaste company that wanted to work with us on analyzing the markets and the risk in countries in Africa on if they should invest there. You never know. And then, the next week it's somebody completely different. You have a lot of things that just come out of the blue. And we're very superstitious often in our firm that we think anytime that we're going to have a slow period is usually when war breaks out. So we always want to be busy because that's when war doesn't happen. It'll always happen. Dr. Hulsman's got a trip coming up here at the end of June for his partner's 50th birthday. I guarantee something bad will happen at the end of June because of that. But it's, for me, really, it's making sure to keep Dr. Hulsman focused on what are the priorities of the firm, what are the priorities of the clients that we currently have going, because there's so much that we'll have to juggle in a day, and you do have to prioritize, you do have to trade off. I'd like to say that, every single client's the highest priority that we're going to have, but some clients are naturally going to be a higher priority. We are a private sector firm. Bottom lines matter at the end of the day. And if a client that has a larger bottom line needs things, those things are likely going to be prioritized. I mean, if we're going to be realist about foreign policy, we should also be realist about how we're going to have to trade off our time. And so those trade-offs often come to me of what we're doing. And then there's unique projects that can come up. John, you know this, and Scarlett helped with this, but Dr. Hulsman recently wrote a book that released last year. And so a lot of our time was consumed by that book, and we had to make those trade-offs as well. So thinking about how you're going to spend your day-to-day is part of my day-to-day.
Yeah, I feel like that's one of the hardest things in work generally is just determining that prioritization and figuring out how to structure when you have like 50 different potential problems. What makes somebody competitive for the kinds of roles that you're seeking? I think maybe if you could answer this question, both for what you've seen from like relatively more entry level people and more mid-career people, because again, as Julie said at the beginning of this, there's a lot of folks who are in the public sector right now entering the private sector against their will and are looking for what to do. So what does competitive look like? Maybe we'll lead off this time with Natalie.
Yeah. When you sent me this question, I was really thinking about it, and I have 3 things I would say. 1, language. That's for entry level or mid-career. If you can speak a foreign language, especially one that isn't heavily covered, obviously I speak Arabic, so that was a big sell for me. A lot of government employees have that, so that would be number 1. Number 2, this is optional, but if you have a clearance or any kind of intelligence experience, that isn't specific to my firm, but if you want any role similar to what I'm doing, clearance would be a huge asset, especially with federal clients. We have federal clients. We forewent our clearance, but still, that would be really competitive. But 3, and what I think is most important, is country or region specific expertise. And that doesn't just mean, I study the Middle East, I understand broad strokes about things. I'm talking about really having a thumb on the pulse of the issues. And I'm thinking about people who maybe are administering aid, who are doing a lot of different roles in the government that are focusing on one country specifically where they have this very specific expertise. It doesn't have to be in intelligence. I know a lot of people at my firm who are working on cyber, who are working on economics, health, things like that have nothing to do with what I do, with like the military security part of it. But, I study Syria, and there's the upper idea of what people understand of Syria, and then there's a very specific level. And so doing my thesis on that, really having an understanding of the group dynamics, sets me apart from somebody else who might be a Middle East analyst, but when they look at Syria and the absolute hellfire that was going on a couple months ago, and they don't understand the group dynamics, they don't understand why Turkey's over here, but doing something completely different in a different region. It's just an asset to understand those kinds of dynamics. And so I think there are a lot of opportunities for public sector employees to move to the private sector with that country level expertise, and that would completely outweigh something like a clearance or intelligence experience. And have absolute applications at like either my firm or a competitor.
Scarlett, John, you want to get in on this? Competitive employees.
Yeah, one thing that I'll touch on, because Natalie really hit the nail on the head on a lot of those hard skills that are going to be needed, especially at larger firms. I think one thing that's challenging for people, especially depending on if you're trying to kind of launch this on your own, is the ability to really be like front facing to clients, like those soft skills that I think are forgotten a lot about. Relationship development, like a lot of my job is really like sales techniques when it all comes down to it. Like, how do we funnel people? How do we take a client that's a 50K client to a 150K client? How do we actually get people down those steps to where a one-off webinar then becomes a yearly retention agreement? How do we do those things? So I think those things get really underrated and forgotten about when somebody's trying to transfer from the public sector into the private sector, where like funding, it frankly just isn't as guaranteed. Like you have to be able to develop and manage those clients. John, I'm sure this is something you've become familiar with, running a nonprofit organization. What you do with donors and developing those relationships to donors really isn't that much different than what I'm doing with clients and developing those relationships. You could probably take somebody from a development team at a nonprofit and make them really good in a political risk firm, because a lot of those skills would transfer over in terms of how you kind of level people up.
Yeah, anyone who listened to Natalie's answer and was feeling nervous, like, oh gosh, I don't have any country expertise or a second language, I think they'll find that my answer is good news. I think at least for my company, the characteristics that we really look for, since we have so much work that's just coming and going and it's all different kinds, we don't prioritize so much expertise in a specific topic, so much as the ability to learn really quickly, pick up a new skill because we got a client that hired us for a project that we currently maybe don't have a lot of capability on and we need to get that fast. Also working with uncertainty. We get asked a lot of questions that there's really no definitive answer to. And so I think that's something you really have to learn. And I think that's just key to being a good analyst in general. So if you've been an analyst for a while, that's probably a skill that you have. But overall, a lot of questions we get, there maybe is not a good answer. And you may even have to answer a different question that's also useful to the client, but maybe not the one that they originally asked. And additionally, one thing that I've seen people struggle with when they transition from public sector to private sector is, at least at Valens, we have billable hours. And I do think that's something that other companies have as well. And so efficiency is a really big thing. I've never worked in government, but I get the sense that when you are working in government, you have the ability to put a lot more time into specific projects and tasks that at least we're able to put over where I work. We need to really work quickly and do what we can with the time that we're given, which again comes to sometimes the question behind the question. Maybe we don't have the resources or time to put in to answer a question that's going to take like a month of research. But if the client asks for the deliverable back in a week, we need to find a way to get at it, and also a way to communicate with them what we plan on giving them to make sure that they're happy with the end product. So I think those skills are all good to have. Language and specific country expertise and a clearance are, of course, always going to be great. But if you don't have those things, I think that there's probably places where you could fit in that if you have these characteristics where you can just learn really quickly and kind of be flexible, you can also be a really good asset to certain companies.
So what got you into this field? Maybe we'll lead off with John.
Yeah, this is a good one. This is a real T-ball question for me, because what got me into this field was working for the John Quincy Adams Society. A few years ago, we did a book tour with Dr. John Hulsman on one of his earlier books, To Dare More Boldly, The Audacious Story of Political Risk. And I had the bright idea when we were doing this book tour. I was our Southern Regional Director at the time at John Quincy Adams Society, and that since Dr. Hulsman was coming from Italy, he wouldn't have a U.S. driver's license, and we had a lot of Southern colleges, SEC schools to go to. So I said, you know what, why don't I just fly down there, pick him up at the Birmingham airport, and I'll drive him to all these different places. And so we spent 4 or 5 days together in a car, going from campus to campus, flew back up to DC and did a couple more events. And that's how I originally met Dr. Hulsman, and the work sounded incredibly interesting. And it's not something that I immediately transitioned into. And it kind of goes back to my last answer on client relationship, is I just kind of continued to develop that relationship with Dr. Hulsman, talking to him, checking in with him when he'd be in DC. We would grab lunch or dinner, something like that. And eventually the opportunity came up that he needed somebody to kind of help keep him focused, manage his schedule, chief of staff sort of role. And that's where I came in and ended up fitting in. It was probably, I'd say, 3.5 years after that book tour until I actually started working with John. So working with the John Quincy Adams Society is what led to this opportunity, frankly.
Yes, and as you were describing what you did, what you do for Dr. Hulsman, I was like, oh, that's sort of what you did for us. A lot of relationship development, a lot of relationship management, working with chapter leaders, et cetera. And so, like, that's a very valuable skill set that I think I'm always telling people when I'm advising them on their careers to think of their soft skills as a major asset, especially early career. When you might not have as much on your resume otherwise. And there's a big list. If you Google 135 soft skills, there's a great list, an article that I've sent to everybody. I'm seeing some smiles here, possibly from people on this panel to whom I have sent that exact resource. Yes. Scarlett, and then maybe Natalie, if you guys want to get in on this question of what got you into the field.
Yeah, actually, I guess it was kind of alluded to earlier that I previously worked so much on Goodnight and John Hulsman as an intern prior to graduating. I think that's kind of what really got me thinking about private sector jobs, actually. really enjoyed the work that they were doing. It was super interesting. And around that same time, I met the CEO of Valens Global at a student event at UNC, which is where I went to school. I don't think I mentioned that. And we got to talking. The company sounded really interesting, and I really pursued that relationship and developing that. Telling him that I was really interested in working at Valens, doing research into the company, speaking to some other people that had worked there previously. So perhaps if there's a theme here so far, it's networking is extremely useful. That is how I would say I got my job. And I do think that most people working at my company right now also got into it by building relationships with people who are already within the company.
Natalie.
Yeah, I'll do a JQAS plug because I think what got me into this field was Julie and our extensive conversations about what I wanted out of my career. Because I was at a think tank. I loved studying the Middle East. I loved my work, but I wanted something a bit more rigorous, more structured, kind of everything I've been saying about wanting to have a hyper focus on these countries. And so through talking to Julie, talking about what I wanted, she said, I really think that this sounds like something that would appeal to you. So if I have any advice, I mean, I got my job truly just by applying. I didn't network. I didn't know anyone that I worked with. But I would highly recommend talking to people who know you and who know you professionally and who can open your eyes to things that you never would have thought of, because I thought I had to be at a think tank to do research. I had to be in this one avenue in order to do what I really wanted to do. But there's a lot of research opportunities and really fun things you can sink your teeth into in many different avenues if you talk to someone like Julie or whoever at JQAS who know more roads you can take than you do.
Yeah, and I will say to our listeners, for those of you who aren't familiar with the society, one of the things we do is career consultation for people working in national security, defense, foreign policy, especially when those careers touch policy issues, questions of public concern. Julie.
Sure. Well, I guess I'm also very happy to have more of those conversations too. I'd like to think that they're helpful, as it was always nice to have a plug that they are indeed. So one of the questions that I wanted to ask you all, just switching gears a little bit, was partially, how did you find your current role or company? I think we've covered that pretty well. The answer is largely networking and talking to folks. But I know that some of the other listeners might find it a little bit daunting to look at, well, okay, maybe I am interested in political risk or in consultancy, but there are just so many different companies out there. So how would you recommend job seekers navigate the landscape of the many companies that are doing this type of work to find an appropriate role for themselves?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. That's a tough question as well, because of some of those people might, more senior along the way, might even think about doing this on their own. If you have a large Rolodex, it's not something that you necessarily need a company for. I mean, this is a Rolodex driven space. Who are your contacts? What are your what can you give your contacts that they would pay for? I don't want to oversimplify it, but that's kind of the meat and potatoes of it all. But I think if you are looking at joining an already established company, reaching out to somebody that works there and talking to them about what it's like. What is that space like? What is their day-to-day, week-to-week look like? How did they get into that? What do they like about it? What don't they like about it? I mean, there are definitely challenges to this sort of space. I think all of us have kind of alluded to those potential, just like you think you're going to have a nice relaxing day or a good sleep, and you wake up and something's gone terribly wrong and you have to find ways to respond to it. You have a lot of unique questions that you get to answer, and those things can be just as rewarding as they are daunting at times. So I think just finding ways to talk to people that are in that space and trying to find the right fit. I mean, it is a challenge, but you gotta start somewhere. And I think just sending those emails to people that are doing the work that you're interested in and making sure it's something you'd actually want to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Scarlett? Oh, no, Natalie, go ahead.
I would say my answer is twofold. One, I kind of did a reverse search of I was looking for jobs that were looking for things that I had. So country specific, they were looking for countries that I was covering. And so that is how I found my job, was a bit of a reverse. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew what I had to offer. But then what advice I would give to find an appropriate role? I think the important thing is an appropriate role. Seerist is partnered with Control Risk, so I work with tons of different people who do tons of different things. I do intel research. I love it. I want to have a regional and more broad view of things, but we have country analysts that are doing specific countries. We have embedded analysts that are working for only one client and only covering their needs, and they hire us to send them an intel analyst. We have people who are stuck in a room all day, on call, every day is different, responding to client requests. We have federal salespeople who've been in the intel community, been in the federal government, at state, whatever, whose sole job is to help our clients navigate the analysis, because it is kind of daunting to be given all of this information and not know what that means for you specifically. So I think if I had any advice, I would say really be introspective about what you want out of your role, because a lot of the time, if you find 5 companies, especially if they're bigger companies, they have a million roles for a million different people who have very different skills and very different wants out of the job that they're looking for. And so, at Control Risks, I could have done a bunch of different things. And if I had just decided on Control Risks, that wouldn't have landed me in the job that was actually appropriate for me and what I was looking for. And so maybe be a little bit of Goldilocks, like really think about what you want and what's hot, what's cold, and what's just right. Because they might all be in one place, if that makes sense.
One thing I can add to that is you may even think a little bit about whether you see yourself working more for a smaller company or a larger one. There's advantages to both. Working in a smaller one, I've been able to take on a lot more leadership roles, and I've gotten to do things that at this point I never would have otherwise at this point in my career. I've taken charge of really big projects, and I've gotten to meet with clients and handle client relationships within my first 1 or 2 years on a job, which has been really cool. However, if you're someone who really thrives on a lot of structure and hierarchy and having someone that you report to and who gives you instructions, you may prefer a larger company. Some people work better that way. There's a lot of situations where I may be giving directions to someone who's above me, and then the next day they're directing me. So there's not a lot of hierarchy where I work, and probably some other smaller firms as well. So that's another thing you can think about, is if you would prefer a smaller structure or a larger one.
Yeah, this is familiar to me, having, working in a relatively small organization. JQAS has 5 staff right now. And being in this space, I have learned so much. And the organization I was at previously was like under 20 staff. And so there's a lot of stuff you encounter where it's like, all right, well, somebody's got to do this. So I'm going to have to learn how to do X, Y, and Z, how to work on a website or do all kinds of stuff. And that can be pretty cool, because it gives you a different set of skills that you never necessarily sought out to have.
Yeah, that's really true. Another question that I wanted to ask you all was just, what do you know now about the private sector or political risk industry that you wish you had known when you were job hunting?
I think just maybe I think I somewhat expected this, but I want to make sure I give some sort of good answer to this question. But just how unique and personal, at least on my end of things, are. I think a good story of this is a couple years ago, about a year and a half ago, John and I were out in Dubai with a client, and we had several different meetings with him throughout the week. And the first couple, they went well, but they weren't home run meetings. They were at the office, the client's office. They went fine, but there wasn't a breakthrough moment. And then we had gotten dinner, and I was wearing my Philadelphia Eagles lapel pin, and the client commented on my lapel pin, and we started talking about Philly sports and that he has a brother that's in Boston. We ended up talking for 30 minutes just about sports cities in America. And from there on, everything just started to go super smooth. And by the end of the meeting, we were able to kind of up our contract and our commitment by double with what that client originally was. And it was just kind of an odd breakthrough, one that that we wouldn't expect at all. And we ended up talking about some of the same things that we talked about in the office earlier that day that just weren't sticking, but something about kind of being outside the office and having a meal together and talking about like sports in America created that weird breakthrough moment to start talking back. Like, I won't get too specific into what we were doing, but to what was relevant to our clients' needs. And so it was just really random. And it was really just reminded me how like personal this industry really is. For better or for worse, like people like to pay people they like.
Makes sense. And Scarlett, Natalie, anything you would like to add? Okay. Well, I do have one more question on this. Yeah. Just I know that many of the students and young professionals who I advise come to JQA for advice, particularly because they want to have an influence on foreign policy, on moving the needle towards realism and restraint. And I think that some of them are hesitant. I'm serving a company's interest, or I'm serving a client's interest, and I'm not actually working towards realism and restraint. And I think that's a notion that I try to disabuse them of, that I do actually believe that you can promote realism and restraint from just about anywhere. But I'm curious, how would each of you say that you influence foreign policy towards realism and restraint in your own role?
I can go first. Well, one, I would say to especially entry-level people that you are only as helpful as like when you are most, credentialed and experienced. And as someone who was at a think tank when they were 22, the opinions and the things that I would write as a 26-year-old who's now stared at the Middle East for two of the most eventful years that I've ever been a part of, I would write very different things, and I would have a very different focus and have a very different perspective on the policies that we have and the work that we're doing. That's not saying that I wasn't always realism and restraint, and I'm not saying that the op-eds I wrote when I was 22 were bad in any way, but I'm just saying that with life comes experience that helps you be more helpful and be more successful. And so I definitely wouldn't turn a blind eye to a great opportunity to educate yourself. My firm offers tuition reimbursement, language classes. I'm learning every single day that I stare at my computer and stare at my countries. Covering the Israel-Palestine conflict for a year at extreme high detail, like, please, that is 100% useful in 5 years when we're trying to solve that. Well, whatever, we'll see what happens. But so I would just say, first and foremost, you're not going to get on the NSC when you're 22. So maybe just take a step back and learn some things. But also, there is such a power in de-escalatory language and analysis. I think that a lot of our clients are very scared. Like, that is the point of political risk consulting, is that you're trying to assuage their fears or tell them when their fears are valid. Especially, with the Red Sea last year, that was something that was extremely scary for clients and extremely relevant. But as a credit to the US military, it was largely not super impactful. And for the most part, our clients weren't at risk as much as maybe they feared that they would be. So I do think there is a lot of power in telling people it's okay, and actually nothing's changing, and nothing will change for you based on all these scary things that you're hearing. And so I do think a lot of where we get into issues with hawkish language is because people are so scared. Like, why are they so successful at selling these narratives that we need to go to war and we need to fight and die for X, Y, and Z cause? It's because people are scared and people are worried that it's going to impact business, security, whatever. So saying it won't, and if the worst happens, it will be okay. Maybe not the worst, but a bad scenario happens, it will be okay. That is half the battle. We have a lot of military clients who come and look to our analysis to say, okay, maybe the sky is not falling. So I do think it's extremely important. You can work in federal, like, security risk consulting and be talking to very high up people and telling them that guns down, things like that. So I wouldn't pigeonhole the industry so much that you think it's so separate. And I would be open to any experience that will teach you something that could make you more useful later on. Like every stepping stone is equally valuable in getting you where you need to go. You can't just leap over it.
Yeah, really echoing what Natalie said. I mean, at the end of the day, realism and restraint is just a way of viewing how the world works. And people who disagree with it, they have a different idea of how the world works. However, if you are an analyst, your job really should just be to report the facts. And so if that is how you believe the world works, there should be no reason for you to be writing something different. You will have plenty of opportunities to write analysis that's in agreement with those views. Because you should be objective. And if you feel that you're working at a company that's making you write something that you don't agree with, then you probably should rethink where you're working. You should be just researching and then writing conclusions that come as a result of your research. And also, that being said, if the concern is that you won't be able to influence policy, working in private sector isn't all about helping corporations. There's a lot of contracting, government contracting, bit of a question mark as to where that's going, but there's definitely still opportunities, I think, to directly impact government and policy if that's what you're looking for.
Yeah, I think this question's probably one of the easier ones for me because I'm lucky enough to work for somebody that believes very strongly in realism and restraint. For those of you familiar with Dr. Hulsman, I'll try to channel him here. Our clients don't need Wilsonian wish casting that's constantly wrong. They need people to actually be right, and realism is the tool that you can use to actually be right. You can't be an analyst if you're a Wilsonian wish caster because you're never actually willing to look at the truth. It's why our firm has such a great call rate, frankly, because we actually use realism every single day in our analyst. Like, there's never, we wouldn't hire somebody or work with somebody that's not a realist. We treat it as our pretty much our founding principle of the firm. And I think when you look at other analysts out there that do not use realism as their forefront and more so enjoy the kind of white wine cocktail party scene, they've gotten a lot wrong in the last 6 years. And maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, you could constantly be wrong and people would still hire you because being wrong didn't matter. But now it does. When companies actually start to lose money because you don't think Brexit's going to happen, when companies start to lose money because you think Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris are shooing for the elections, when you actually start losing money because you say, when you listen, someone says Russia's not going to invade Ukraine, you start to actually want to hire people who are right. So frankly, our firm doesn't believe you can be a serious analyst if you're not a realist.
Yeah, this gets to something we talk about a lot in the office and with partner organizations is in the public policy space, there's not always a penalty for being wrong. And in fact, there's sometimes a penalty for being right too early. Yeah. And people don't follow up discovering that they were wrong with turning more to the people who are right. They often just are kind of like, well, those folks are still crazy. I'm going to stick with my buddies and me who were all wrong, but we were wrong together and go down together. And so I do think that's actually a plus of the private sector. Another thing I would say to our folks thinking about the private sector world who want to have a long-term impact on public policy is that the two careers are not in competition. One of the best pieces of advice I ever heard was like, if you're looking to work in administration, you should make that like one of the things that you're interested in and not like the only pillar of your career. You need to have a career that is going to make sense by its own internal logic and not solely be just aiming for the political stuff, because the ball can break against you any number of times. Like there's a strong element of luck or fortune or providence, whatever you want to call it, in being the right person, right place, right time with the right relationships to get those kind of appointments. And I would also say there's a lot of folks who go from the private sector into government. I mean, people used to refer to Goldman Sachs as government Sachs because of all the people who go in, and it seems like both Republican and Democratic administrations.
Great. Well, that's all of the questions that I had. I guess, is there anything that you want to give off as a parting shot, or anything that you really wanted to make sure that we covered that we haven't had a chance to yet today?
I would just say, for anyone who is early career, you've probably heard this a million times before, but if you are feeling the imposter syndrome, just know that your first year or two working, you learn so much, way more than you'll ever learn in school. And you'll also learn about other people that you work with. It's less about having all this expertise and sometimes more about just knowing how to think. There's a lot of value in that, and you will build the expertise. So if you're feeling a little shy or nervous, don't, and try to gain some confidence from that.
Yeah, I think I have two things. One, building off of that, a lot of people in the private sector understand the value of different perspectives and the value of having a lot of people who come from a lot of backgrounds tackling the same issue. So if you don't think that you perfectly fit whatever role it is, you might be surprised by the value that they see in the background that you have, because fresh eyes are usually sometimes the correct eyes, because you're not entrenched in 40 years of intelligence that was largely not super successful. So I would say that definitely don't be intimidated if maybe it doesn't seem like a cookie cutter fit. But also I would say the volume of opportunities out there is astounding to me. I know it seems like the job market is crazy and there's nothing, but every single company has intelligence teams, and the intelligence firms are massive. And the amount of analysts that we need to cover all of the clients that we have is insane. And so it might take a little bit to figure out where exactly you fit in and where exactly your puzzle piece is going to go. But I really didn't understand just how massive this industry is, just how many people are tackling the exact same issues. All you have to do is look at like the most recent conference, hundreds and hundreds of companies all coming at it from a different lens. So I do think there's a lot of opportunity there. It is daunting. It is scary to find those things, but yeah, I mean, they're everywhere. Meta has an insane intelligence team. So places like you wouldn't expect to look might have the perfect opportunity for you.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you all so much for being here today, and thank you for sharing your insights.
Thank you so much.
Security Dilemma is a podcast by the John Quincy Adams Society. To learn more about our programs, visit our website at jqas.org. Remember to rate and review on your podcast app and join us every Tuesday for new episodes of Security